probably got a message or some kind of little pop-up thing that says we're recording. So, and this evening I am going to be doing a lot of toggling back and forth between screens and things like that. So would one of you be willing to be my chat monitor? So if I miss a question or something in the chat, will you just jump out and let me know? Would somebody be willing to do that for me tonight? Adriana, would you be willing to do that for me tonight?
Yes, please.
Okay, thank you.
Sorry.
Okay. All right, so let's go ahead and jump in. We have a lot to cover, so I want to make sure that we have enough time for everything this evening. And as we created our group agreements last week, I just want to take a moment to just quickly go through them. We'll do this a few times just so we get used to our group agreements and remembering them. And then once we've done that a few times, I'll share them in the chat and you can review them on your own. We won't have to do this every time, but I think it's important as we're starting to come together as a learning community. So would one of you be willing to read the first two for us? Alicia or Alicia? One of you be willing to read the first two for us?
Yeah, I can.
Okay, thank you, Alicia.
Great. So listen with respect for all the voices without fixing, problem solving, or advice. Allow others time to speak before speaking for yourself. Ask for what's needed for yourself or for the group. Speak from your own experience, from the I. Allow space for differences. Be aware of your judgments. Suspend certainty and assumptions. There is no good, bad, right, or wrong, true or false. Be mindful and respectful that we come with our own experiences and differences. Be present, on time, on camera, and on point, ready to be your best self.
Awesome. Thank you so much for reading all of them. I was just going to have you read the first two, so thank you.
Oh, sorry, I just kind of
it's fine.
kept going.
You did great. Actually, I wanted to mention that I added that last one. It was something that we didn't address last week, but it is really important to me that we are building this kind of community of trust and equity. And so if you do have a concern or an issue about the last one that I personally added, please just private message me and we can have a conversation about it. But otherwise, we're going to go ahead and move on. Okay, so welcome, Melina. Good to have you. Glad you made it home safely. And so just a couple quick announcements. Just want to, before we dive in, I just want to make sure we cover a couple things before we dive in so we have time. First of all, I wanted to say thank you to all of you for such great reflections on your reflection forms last week. I did have a chance to read through all of them and just really appreciated how thoughtful and that you took your time to really think through the questions and everything like that. So that was super. Loved reading those. I also wanted to mention that, and again, this is the last time I'll say it. I just know that we're new to this course and this PLC, so just want to make sure that everybody's on the same page, that we're all knowing what the expectations are. Just remember that the PLCs and the reflection forms are some of the biggest portions of your grade. So those are each worth 10 points per week. And, if there's a situation like you're running late, you got stuck in traffic, you need to be a few minutes late, or you have a legitimate reason to be absent from the PLC. Of course, like I said, just keep in touch with me. I'll always try to work with you. But I don't want you to start losing a lot of points. So, if it becomes something of an issue, we can have a conversation and see what will help you be successful. I don't expect that to be a concern for anyone, but I just want to make sure that we, have everyone understanding that expectation. Then I wanted to just to show you a couple or a quick change that I made that I hope will be a little bit better for our assignment schedule. So let me just share my screen again. This is going to be the syllabus. And remember that the syllabus is linked in your student resources folder, which I will try to link every week in the weekly readings and assignments document that I send out. So if you haven't had a chance to read through the syllabus, it is a good idea to do that. So please do. I just want to show you a quick change that I made. I was looking through kind of what we had on our schedule for next week, for this upcoming week after we have our session tonight. There's going to be a couple of modules that you're going to complete for the weekly readings and assignments. And I felt like that was quite a bit. So I extended the due date for this philosophy of being an early childhood educator to the 19th. That's a Sunday. It's an unusual due date. Usually I have everything due on Wednesdays just to make it easy to remember. But I'm giving you an extension so that you have a few extra days. So just be aware of that. We'll talk more about that later. We won't cover it tonight. I'll probably include some information tomorrow in my email with the weekly readings and assignments. And then in October, if you remember, we were talking about that we'll be doing this lesson on trauma-informed care in childcare spaces. It's a really good module, but it is kind of long. And as I was looking through it, it looked to me like it was going to be too overwhelming to try and do all of it for one due date. So there's 4 modules. So we'll spread it out over the month and we'll do 1 module per week. So this is not until October, so it's not anything you need to worry about tonight, but I just wanted to point that out just so you knew that I made that change. So we'll just, like I said, do 1 per week. And then that will hopefully be a little bit easier on everybody's workload. So any questions about that? Okay. So thank you. And I'm going to now share my screen again with another thing. So as I said, thanks for your grace and patience as I'm toggling all over the place tonight. Just give me a moment here to get myself situated. Actually, I'll do it this way. So we're going to be switching again here in a minute. Okay. Okay. So again, this is going to be a lot of me talking tonight. So I apologize about that in advance, but this is going to be a really good foundation to the rest of our time together, because brain development, I think, is one of the most important aspects of child development. Because it controls everything else. It controls all the other types of development: cognitive development, social emotional development, physical development, all of those things. So we really want to start with having a good understanding of the brain And this presentation is from an organization called 0 to 3. It's a great resource. There's tons of information on that website, so it's a good one for you as an educator to know about. And they have a program called The Growing Brain. And a dear friend and colleague of mine, Phyllis Lucas, graciously allowed me to use her slides this evening. Usually she does this presentation. She is also teaching a class, so I'll be sharing this presentation with you. And so we're going to actually start by watching a quick video. Sorry, I have to share again because I did it the wrong way. I'm gonna watch a quick video about why brain development in early childhood is so important. Can you see a YouTube screen? Melina, I don't know what that means. No, okay. Okay, let me try again, sorry. Okay, now we should be good. Yes, thank you.
Being an executive.
Okay, sorry to be annoying, but can you just, are you able just to see my slide or do you see my presenter view?
Just the slide.
Okay, thank you very much. Sure, I'm showing the right thing. Awesome. Okay. So just a little like preview of why brain development is so important. And so tonight we're going to, bless you, we are talk about our learning objectives, excuse me, for tonight are we are going to identify factors that affect brain growth and development. We are going to learn about the impact of stress on brain development, and then we will learn about the 5 R's for supporting healthy brain growth and development. So to start things off, we're going to talk about something called brain plasticity. Brain plasticity gives our brains the ability to grow and to learn. We have a lot of it when we are babies, but it decreases with age. So if you see that red line at birth, you have more of this brain plasticity. It decreases over the age span. And it also takes more psychological efforts to keep our brains active and learning as we age. So we have less psychological effort at the beginning of our lives, and then it takes more, as you're looking at that blue line, as we age. So brain plasticity is a really important factor in brain development as children are in their early years. And so we're going to be talking about how the brain develops, and there are certain functions, of course, that the brain certain parts of the brain are in charge of. And kind of an easy way to think about this, and you may have taken other classes where you've learned about brain development in different ways, but for this session, we're going to be talking about the top functions and the bottom functions. And we'll talk more about what those mean here. So the bottom functions receive signals from our senses and use memories to interpret their meaning. So the bottom function helps us with our feelings and our perceiving functions. And then the top functions take in and process information and then take action. So our top function of the brain is the area of the brain that's really taking in all of the sensory information. And then the bottom function is what processes that sensory information. So if you are seeing something, if you are looking at something and seeing it, your top function of your brain is taking that in and absorbing that. And then the bottom function figures out what to do with that information. So if it's a tiger in front of you, your bottom function of your brain is going to be reacting in some way, like maybe I should figure out how to get out of this situation where a tiger is potentially going to be coming at me. So the top and the bottom work together. And the top function also is the problem solving area of the brain. So your bottom function says, oh my goodness, I'm feeling scared because there's a tiger in front of me. Then your top function is going to say, okay, what do we need to do to get out of this situation safely? Okay. Hopefully nobody ever has to come face to face with a tiger, except in a safe space like a zoo. All right. And again, please just jump in if you have any questions. I'm going to be going through this a little bit quickly just because there's so much. And so you can put questions in the chat. You can just unmute and shout out. Adriana has been very gracious to be our chat monitor tonight in case I missed something. But we actually are going to watch another video now. So let me escape all of this and get back to our videos about brain architecture and how we build neural connections.
A child's experiences during the earliest years of life have a lasting impact on the architecture of the developing brain. Genes provide the basic blueprint, but experiences shape the process that determines whether a child's brain will provide a strong or weak foundation for all future learning, behavior, and health. During this important period of brain development, billions of brain cells called neurons send electrical signals to communicate with each other. These connections form circuits that become the basic foundation of brain architecture. Circuits and connections proliferate at a rapid pace and are reinforced through repeated use. Our experiences and environment dictate which circuits and connections get more use. Connections that are used more grow stronger and more permanent. Meanwhile, connections that are used less fade away through a normal process called pruning. Well-used circuits create lightning-fast pathways for neural signals to travel across regions of the brain. Simple circuits form first, providing a foundation for more complex circuits to build on later. Through this process, neurons form strong circuits and connections for emotions, motor skills, behavioral control, logic, language, and memory during the early critical period of development. With repeated use, these circuits become more efficient and connect to other areas of the brain more rapidly. While they originate in specific areas of the brain, the circuits are interconnected. You can't have one type of skill without the others to support it. Like building a house, everything is connected, and what comes first forms a foundation for all that comes later.
Awesome. Back to my slides here. So do we see just the slide? That's okay. Thank you. It's like the Zoom, death by Zoom. I'm sorry. Just sure. Okay. Yeah, so as that little short video was showing you, when you think about the development and the growth of the brain, if you're thinking about it as in terms of architecture, like you can't build a building just by stacking some bricks on top of each other, because that won't be stable, right? We have to build a foundation. We have to build the inside structure of the building first before the bricks can go on later. And so we would really want to build a solid foundation for children and their brain growth and development. And as the video was talking about, neural connections are really what's building the internal structure of the brain. And I really love this graphic because it's phenomenal to me what happens inside of a child's brain in the first 5 years of life. So as you see at birth, there are just a few neural connections that have taken shape, taken form. By the age of 6, you can see how many more neural connections there are. It's just a wild pile of neural connections everywhere. And at a certain point, children's brains are developing 1 million neural connections per second, which is, unbelievable. How can that even be possible? But their brains are just growing so rapidly. And those neural connections are heavily influenced by the early experiences that children have in their lives. And we're going to be talking a lot more about that tonight and throughout our time together over the next few weeks. But then, as you see, as a child ages, this young lady looks to be about 14 years old, there are fewer neural connections. And that is because it's called due to a process that is called pruning, because the brain actually starts to develop more neural connections than it can use. It's almost like, if you have too many like plugs, like cords plugged into an extension cord or an outlet or something like that, you might short circuit that outlet. So you really want to have what the brain does is it compensates for that. So it says, there's too many neural connections. We don't need all of these. We're going to take the ones that we need, that we're going to be able to use all the time to be able to function as a human being. But then we're going to prune or kind of get rid of the rest. And so by the age of about 13, 14, 15, some of those neural connections have been pruned and they disappear, and you will never get those back. So we actually want to make sure that we keep as many neural connections as possible. So there are many factors that influence the healthy growth and development of the brain. So some of those factors include gene and environment interactions, and we'll talk more about each of these, but just as a quick overview. Nutrition, sleep, exposure to toxic substances, diseases and disorders of the brain in early childhood, and the role of relationships. So we are going to talk a little bit more about each of these. Cheyenne, I just saw your message about some internet connection issues. We'll definitely send this link out to everyone. So you might log out and log back in. That might help. I'm not sure, but sorry you're having some trouble. Okay, so let's talk a little bit about what this gene environment interactions is. So everyone has what's called DNA, and our DNA gives us a blueprint, gives our bodies a blueprint for building the brain. It's like the architectural plans. So you don't go building a house or a building, just like I said, by just stacking some bricks on each other. You have to have a plan, right? You have to know what you do first, what you do second, what you do third. You have to know what materials you need, what structures you need to build before you can add the final bricks, all of those things, right? So that's what our DNA does for us, for our brain growth. But in the environment can influence its ultimate development. So these other factors that we're going to talk about next are environmental factors, and they can all play a huge role in how a child's brain develops, either in healthy or unhealthy ways. So let's talk about that. So nutrition is a huge factor in the development of healthy brains. And this is probably not news to anyone, but it is a really significant influence of how brains can grow and develop. So, brains need lots of healthy nutrients to be able to grow in healthy ways. So malnutrition can be a definite concern if a child is not receiving the proper nutrients that they need. It can slow down brain growth. It can thin out the cerebral cortex, which is what protects the brain. So it can be more susceptible to all kinds of things like illness and delayed development, things like that. And it can also reduce the number of neural connections between the neurons. So as I said, we want to keep as many of those neural connections as possible. So we need good nutrition to be able to do that. Another important factor, probably again, not news to anyone, but sleep is a critical factor in brain development. And this recommendation here is from the American Academy of Pediatrics. So infants need up to 16 hours of sleep per day toddlers need up to 14 hours and preschoolers need up to 13 hours. Believe it or not. So sometimes, as we know, we have children in our classrooms that are better sleepers than others. But that's why it's at least important to give children a rest time during the day, even if they don't sleep. Because when children are resting or sleeping, that actually is the time when brain growth is actively occurring. So we want to make sure that children have adequate sleep for healthy development. Another huge factor that can influence brain development, of course, is exposure to toxic substances. So exposure during pregnancy can negatively impact brain development. So things like alcohol, cigarettes, some street drugs, illegal substances, some prescription drugs, and other types of substances can negatively impact brain development. In addition to that, there are certain environmental toxins that we call heavy metals. So you may be familiar with some of these as well, things like mercury, which is found sometimes in fish, lead, which is sometimes found in paint or in pipes, and manganese, which I'm not entirely sure where that's found, but it's not a good thing either. So we want to make sure that we can limit any kind of exposure to toxic substances for young children during pregnancy and after pregnancy. After that child has been born, that can really impact brain development. The next thing that can affect brain development are certain types of neurological disorders. These can be developed as hereditary. It could be developed during the prenatal period. There's all kinds of neurological disorders that can be developed in all kinds of different ways. We're not going to spend a whole lot of time digging into those this evening, although that may be an area of interest for you at some point. And you know, some of you, especially as teachers, may work with children who experience neurological disorders. So this might be something that you'd like to learn about more at some point. But just to give a quick overview, neurological disorders can cause dysfunction in the brain or the nervous system. There might be physical, psychological, behavioral, or cognitive symptoms that arise from a neurological disorder. And as I said, it might be present at birth or during the prenatal period, or those kinds of disorders can also develop later in life. So we want to be vigilant as early childhood educators. If we're noticing something that concerns you about a child's development, their development or growth or milestones, which we'll dive into in the next couple of weeks. As you spend a lot of time with these children, right? So a lot of awake time too. Sometimes families spend more sleeping time with their children than awake time. So we just want to make sure as early childhood educators, we're being very vigilant about just, you know, watching for anything that might be of a concern. Let me pause there and see if there are any questions. Free to unmute. Love to hear your voices.
No questions, just that everything's super interesting.
Thanks, Melina. It is interesting. I agree with you. And it's so important to understand this because this, as I said, is really the foundation of everything that happens in child's developmental period. So, okay, so let's keep moving along. I know I'm going pretty fast, so please, you know, tell me to slow down if I'm going too fast. But as I said, I'll definitely share the link. I'll share the slides. I'll share the link to the recording. So if you want to go back and, spend more time looking at me, then you're welcome to do that. But let's move ahead and talk a little bit about what we call attachment, because attachment also is a huge factor in the growth and development of healthy brains. So what we mean by attachment are the relationships that very young children have with their regular caregivers. And so what we mean by caregivers could be parents, it could be grandparents or other family members who are primary caregivers, spend a lot of time with the child. And it is you as early childhood educators, as teachers or CFEs. You also spend a lot of time with these young children, and so you are also a primary caregiver. And so the relationships that you have with young children can be a huge factor in their brain growth and development. And what we mean when we say attachment is the enduring bond that children form with their regular caregivers, beginning in the earliest stages of life, really at birth. And so healthy attachment is critical for healthy brain development. So let's look at that a little bit more deeply. And when we talk about attachment, we can talk about it in two different ways, secure attachment and insecure attachment. So secure attachment is when primary caregivers are sensitive and responsive to a child's needs. I used to teach a class for parents, brand new parents who were just pregnant with their first baby. And we would talk about why a baby cries. So why does a baby cry? Somebody be brave and unmute and tell me why a baby cries.
To cue when they're hungry or tired or any kind of needs.
Absolutely. Thank you, Cheyenne. So yes, when they need something, when they have a need. So that is how a baby can communicate with you. So in a secure attached relationship, the caregiver is responsive to that baby's needs right away. And there has been a lot of research that's been done on this particular topic. And, even maybe your own parents or grandparents or other generations that you might know, you might have heard them say, oh, just let the baby cry it out. You'll spoil them if you jump in and pick them up, you're going to spoil them. Well, that is opposite of the truth. The truth is if you don't pick up the baby or you don't respond to that child's needs, it actually creates a stress response for that child. And we're going to talk a little bit more about stress here in just a moment and what it can do if it's a prolonged experience for the child. It's not a good thing. So we want secure, responsive, attached relationships with primary caregivers for the best and most optimal growth for healthy growth and brain development. Because it helps children to feel safe and secure. So if you are a baby and you are crying because you are hungry and nobody comes to feed you, what are you going to learn? Right? You're going to learn that when you're hungry, nobody's there to help you. And so that creates insecurity. It creates a feeling of not feeling safe, all kinds of things, right? So again, alluding to an insecure attachment is when caregivers are distant, they're not engaged, or they're inconsistent. Sometimes they pick up the crying baby, sometimes they don't. So that's confusing to a child. They don't know whether to trust that caregiver or not. They don't know whether to feel safe and secure or not. And so when children are not sure about whether their needs will be met, what happens to their brain in that stage is that their brains go to survival mode. They are going to do everything possible to be able to survive because they do not know if a caregiver is going to come and feed them, if a caregiver is going to come and change their diaper, pick them up when they're crying. So they're in survival mode. And so when that happens, they are not going to use their energy to explore their environment, which is really important for their cognitive and physical development, right? We want babies to crawl and to pull something off of the shelf and to explore it and to learn all of the things that happens when you pull something off of a shelf. But when children are in these insecure attached relationships, like I said, they're in survival mode. So all their energy is going to survival, not to the other important things that are necessary for that healthy development. So we're going to watch a video here called the Still Face Experiment. And we can just toggle again, appreciate patience while I do all that. Some of you might have seen this before. So they did a study, some researchers did a study several years ago about this idea of attachment and what happens when a caregiver starts out as an attached caregiver and then becomes an unattached caregiver. And we're going to talk about stress here in just a moment. You're going to see that this child does become stressed, but this is a short burst of stress. And so in this instance, they've created an environment where the child is going to come back to a feeling of safety because it's a very short experience. So I just want to set that up so you know that sometimes I have seen this video like a billion times, and it always impacts me because you see this child who's, you know, asking for help in a sense. So anyway, just want to set that up. And this is just about 2.5 minute video here. Do you see the YouTube screen? Okay, thank you. It's like sometimes it shows me a little outline. I don't know what it's doing now, but.
Babies this young are extremely responsive to the emotions and the reactivity and the social interaction that they get from the world around them. This is something that we started studying 30, 40 years ago, when people didn't think that infants could engage in social interaction. In the still face experiment, what the mother did was she sits down and she's playing with her baby who's about a year of age.
Are you my good girl? Oh.
And she gives a greeting to the baby gives a greeting back to her.
Yeah.
This baby starts pointing at different places in the world, and the mother's trying to engage her and play with her. They're working to coordinate their emotions and their intentions, what they want to do in the world. And that's really what the baby is used to. And then we ask the mother to not respond to the baby. The baby very quickly picks up on this, and then she uses all of her abilities to try and get the mother back. She smiles at the mother. She points because she's used to the mother looking where she points. The baby puts both hands up in front of her and says, "What's happening here?" She makes that screechy sound at the mother, like, come on, why aren't we doing this? Even in this 2 minutes, when they don't get the normal reaction, they react with negative emotions, they turn away, they feel the stress of it, they actually may lose control of their posture because of the stress that they're experiencing.
Okay. I'm here. And what are you doing? Oh, yes. Oh, what a big girl.
It's a little like the good, the bad, and the ugly. The good is that normal stuff that goes on, that we all do with our kids. The bad is when something bad happens, but the infant can overcome it. After all, when you stop the still face, the mother and the baby start to play again. The ugly is when you don't give the child any chance to get back to the good. There's no reparation, and they're stuck in that really ugly situation.
Okay, so I just want to take a moment to debrief that a little bit. It's pretty intense. So what did you notice in that short 2 minutes of that interaction?
When the baby's ignored, she gets frustrated.
It's frustrated, absolutely. Yeah. What else did you notice? What did you notice about the beginning where they were interacting with each other? What did you notice there?
The connection to they had, which is like natural.
Mhm. Yep. So that back and forth, right? They were interacting. Mom was doing something, saying something, looking at what baby was pointing at. Baby was interacting back and forth. We call that a serve and return interaction. We'll learn a lot more about those. And then, as Annalisa pointed out, Annalisa had the point that once the mom started ignoring the baby, she got frustrated pretty quickly, right? She was showing signs of distress, possibly with her posture, with her vocalizations. So was she expressing that an unmet need, would you say?
Yeah, I think so. Just the connection, attachment was the need.
Yeah, she needs that attachment, that connection. So she's saying, what happened? We were just connected and you left me. Where are you? Right? And so then what happens when mom comes back?
She felt safe again and started pointing and laughing. Connections.
Yeah, so she recovers pretty quickly, right? And so we're gonna talk about that here in the next few slides when we're talking about stress, because this was a good example of attachment because it shows you that relationship, how important that relationship is. But this is also a good example of what stress does to a child. And so we're going to unpack that a little bit too. So let me get back to my slides here. Thanks everyone for sharing. Here. Okay. So let me share again. Okay. So yeah, let's talk a little bit about what we call stress response. We all have what is called a stress response when we're presented with stress. How might we respond to it? And we're just going to touch on this briefly tonight because we are going to learn more about stress in children's development over the next few weeks. So we'll just do a quick little overview of this tonight. But actually, a small amount of stress can be helpful because it helps us to become alert, focused, and poised. And I'll explain that more in just a moment. But when we are presented with stress, we will often respond in one of three ways, either fight, flight, or freeze. And you might be familiar with this terminology, you might have heard it before. So we'll dive more into what happens when children are presented with stress and their stress response. So let's talk about what stress does as far as brain development. So very young children, of course, they're developing these neural connections. They're learning how to, they're learning the world, right? They're learning everything. Everything is new. Everything is a new thing around them. They're learning all of these things. They're trying to figure out the world around them. And the types of relationships that young children have with their primary caregivers, as I said before, is a significant part of how they perceive their world. But young children have a very limited ability to cope with stress, and they depend on those primary caregivers, adults, to help them cope with stress or with unmet needs. As we've been talking about, a baby will cry when they're hungry because it's a need that is not met. And a crying baby is a stress response, right? So there's having a stress response to being hungry. So the part of the brain that controls reactions to stress is fully developed at birth, but the forebrain, the front part of the brain that controls our thinking about our feelings, memories, and experiences is still maturing. And if you'll remember, that was a few slides back, that's the top part of the brain. So different parts of the brain are in different stages of development. And so when a child is presented with stress, we want to look at it as a kind of a continuum. So when a child is presented with a small amount of stress, that can actually be a good thing. So for example, if a baby wants to reach for a toy and they can't reach for it, but they're starting to crawl, and maybe they're becoming distressed or upset because they can't reach that toy. Well, they're going to use that stress response that they're experiencing to solve their problem. They're going to use it as a problem-solving skill, and they're going to figure out maybe I can scooch, I can roll, I can wiggle, or maybe I need to cry louder, so my caregiver will come and give this toy to me. So small amounts of stress can be positive. Then we can move into a tolerable range where there might be longer experiences with stress. And depending on how the situation is handled, how the caregivers respond to the child, that can be either a good or bad thing. So it's kind of that yellow zone. And then we will talk about what toxic stress is. So let me jump ahead here so I can talk through a little bit of more of this. So as I mentioned, tolerable stress positive stress. This is the stuff that's kind of normal everyday stuff that we all experience as stress. Like we have to get in the car and drive to work, right? And that can be stressful, but it's kind of normal stress unless something unusual happens. And we learn how to cope with it. We may listen to our music. We might safely call our friend on the phone and as we're driving hands-free, right? So, but there's different ways that we learn how to cope with our kind of normal everyday stress. So this can be the same for children. And it does affect their ability to cope, but when caregivers are responsive to those situations, and I love this picture here, right? So this is a little girl, it looks like, who's learning how to climb a rope structure at the playground. So probably a little stressful. Maybe she's never done it before. She's learning her balance and making sure she can grip the rope tightly enough. But you see her caregiver here supporting her, helping her work through the stress and problem solve how to climb the rope successfully, right? So that kind of stress is good. It can be a good thing. When we move into the tolerable stress area, this is kind of longer lasting types of stress and can be more intense. There's a higher level of cortisol that's released. Cortisol is what we call a stress hormone. So they've measured that in research. And so more tolerable stress has a higher cortisol release. It can possibly disrupt the brain architecture if it is prolonged and if caregivers are not responsive. So those supportive relationships can really help facilitate a child's ability to cope. So I think maybe one example might be a child who's experiencing kind of an illness of some kind, maybe, maybe a long flu or something that has taking some time for that child to heal. That can be a stressful situation, right? But if those primary caregivers are there to take care of the child, respond to their needs, help them through those the frustrations or the sadness of being ill, that child has a much higher likelihood of bouncing back and not being negatively impacted in any way of their brain development. But then when we move into what we call toxic stress is high levels of stress that is prolonged. So this is maybe a situation where a child is experiencing some kind of abuse or trauma, or the family is experiencing some kind of very stressful situation, perhaps something like homelessness or a loss of a family member. All kinds of things can kind of cause this type of strong and prolonged stress. And so your body and your brain are able to cope with that type of stress to a certain extent. And for young children who are developing, their brains are developing, they have a much lower tolerance for being able to handle that kind of high levels of continuous stress. Also, the absence of secure attached relationships with caregivers can be a huge impact on the development of toxic stress, right? So that baby who's never picked up when they cry learns that the only thing they can count on is nothing, right? I mean, that's a terrible way to say it, but they know that they're not going to get a response, but they can't help their stress. They still are going to be hungry, or they're still going to have unmet needs. But when there's no response, that creates higher and higher levels of cortisol and stress response in the brain. And that cortisol can flood the brain even and make it so that the brain can no longer function in a healthy manner. Again, go back to that idea of just survival mode, so that all the energy from the brain and from the body is going to go towards survival and not towards growth, right? So this next slide actually gives you kind of a picture of what it looks like when toxic stress has been a big factor in the factor in a child's early years. So I'll let you take a second to take a look at that. So you can see that in a typically developing brain, all those areas are active, right? They're all actively firing, doing their thing, making connections, neural connections, building those neural connections. And then long-term exposure to toxic stress, as you can see on the right side, there are parts of the brain that just shut down because they can't cope. They can't continue. They can't manage the release of so much cortisol. And there can be some very significant impact of toxic stress. And again, this is a topic that we could spend really the entire semester on, and I'm breezing through it, which is not giving it justice, but as I said, we will be talking about this more in the next few weeks. But these are some of the potential long-term impacts of toxic stress. So it can significantly negatively impact healthy growth and development. And in the long term, there can actually be some pretty significant physical and mental health challenges that a person might experience with exposure to toxic stress. So these are important things for you as early childhood professionals to know and to understand, because you, again, are the front lines of your classrooms or your the families that you work with. And so you just want to be aware, right, of any of these kinds of possible symptoms that you might see in a child, because then you might have an opportunity or a responsibility perhaps to intervene, to find supports and services that that might be able to help that child. So let me just pause there for a moment. This is a little intense of a topic here, and I just want to make sure that we see if you have any questions or thoughts, reflections, comments, anything. I also just want to acknowledge that sometimes, I, as an instructor or a facilitator, I come from my own place of experience and culture and, knowledge kind of thing. And I don't know the experiences of others, of all of you. You might have experienced these kinds of things in your own life in some way, shape, or form. And so I just want to, be respectful of that and acknowledge that. And if anything like this that we're ever talking about is a trigger for you, or, bringing up things for you that feel stressful or uncomfortable, to always feel free to be able to reach out to me. I'm always happy to have, any kind of one-on-one conversation with you. Or, you have questions that you're not comfortable bringing up in front of the group, anything like that. I'm always available. All right. So what do we do about all this stress and such? I think I skipped a poll. Okay. Let me just, I'm just going to keep going so we make sure we can get through everything. So there are lots of ways that we can support healthy brain growth and development. And we're really going to be spending the rest of our weeks together looking into all of the 5 R's is what they're called: relationships, responsive interactions, respect, routines, and repetition. And so these are all factors that play into healthy brain growth and development. And so we're just going to touch on each of these very quickly as just a quick introduction, but as we continue through the rest of our time together, we'll get into each of these more deeply. So we've already been talking about this, that loving, secure, warm relationships based on attachment give children the foundation they need for healthy development. We will definitely dive into that more as well. So some of the ways that caregivers can be responsive, and a positive way is follow the child's lead, be sensitive, have those back and forth interactions, what we call serve and return interactions, and be tuned into the child that you're with, that you're taking care of, or that you're working with if you're an educator. Watch for their cues, watch for their needs. Make sure that you're responsive in positive ways. So, as we know, what we call, and we'll talk about this more later too, but what we call challenging behaviors, right? So is the behavior challenging to the child, or is it challenging to you? Most of the time it's challenging to you as the caregiver or the teacher. So I invite us to rethink the term challenging behaviors, because when, we've been talking about babies a lot tonight, but as children grow older, they share with you different ways to express their unmet needs, right? And that's sometimes what we call challenging behaviors, because this child is behaving in a certain way, perhaps to get their need met. And that might be pushing your buttons in some way. So I really encourage us to rethink that idea of challenging behaviors, and think in a way of, what is this behavior saying? What is this behavior trying to tell me right now as a caregiver? Maybe it's that I need to stop what I'm doing and be in tune with this child in this moment, or follow the child's lead, or whatever it might be. So we'll explore more about that. Talked about serve and return interactions. You'll be exploring that over the next few days on your own, so I won't spend much time on there. The next R is respect. And so we know that respectful, responsive relationships are also very critical for healthy brain growth and development. So we'll dive into this more when we're talking about guidance and executive function, and all of those kinds of things. But it's our obligation and our responsibility as early childhood educators to have an understanding, at least a basic understanding, of child development and why children might behave in certain ways, and how we can be responsive and respectful to that behavior. So are we showing empathy? Are we showing understanding? Are we providing support when a child is exhibiting a behavior that might be telling you that they have an unmet need? So are we guiding instead of punishing, right? So those kinds of things that we really want to think about as early childhood educators. Routine is also a really big influence, plays a big role, in healthy growth and development. Children really can thrive with routines that they can predict and depend on. And why might that be? Why do you think children need routines?
It provides consistency. It eases stress on them, so that we don't have to worry about what's coming next. They kind of already know.
So it provides some predictability, so they understand what's coming next. In situations where we're talking about that continuum of stress, right? So positive stress is like, oh, I know that I'm hungry, but I know that lunch is next, because lunch always comes after we go on the playground, right? When we get into that tolerable or even toxic stress area, it's, I don't know when I get to go to bed. I don't know when I get to eat. I have no control over any of those things. I have no knowledge of any of those things. Sometimes my mom is there, sometimes she's not. That kind of like severe lack of routines can actually create higher levels of stress and stress response. Melina,
Sorry. Yeah, but I think it is important to let them know when we are not able to follow a routine, because then it's when I'm thinking in Spanish, sorry.
Okay, take your time.
Yeah, when we don't like let them know in advance that we're changing something, yeah, that's when they kind of start acting like I forgot the word in English, but it's like, yeah, they start crying or they start acting in a different way because like they don't know, they're used to something. So that's important just to communicate to them.
Yeah, that's a great point, Melina, because when you communicate with children, even if they're very young children and they may not understand all of the words, it does help let them know that the routine is changing because of this. So you're almost building in like a buffer, right? So it's not just you don't get dinner because you don't get dinner, but you don't get dinner right now because we have to get home first and then you'll get dinner. So when you can help children kind of understand that progression, is a great point. Any other thoughts, questions? Cheyenne is having some issues, connections, so she got kicked off. Hopefully we'll get her back here in a moment. Okay, so we have just a few more slides left here, but routine is, or repetition, excuse me, is also a critical factor in healthy growth and development. Why would something like repetition be helpful for children's growth and development?
To secure those neural connections, like we were talking about earlier, you don't use it, you'll lose it. So making those repetitions is going to make those connections stronger.
Absolutely, yeah, helps strengthen those neural connections. So you might have experienced a child that wants you to read that same book over and over and over and over and over and over until you both have every single word of it memorized. But that repetition is, like Alicia was sharing, is really strengthening those neural connections. So, and they're learning something every time you read that book. They're learning about words, they're learning about letters and sounds and shapes and how sentences are put together. They're learning about story sequence, like what comes first and what comes next and what comes last. All kinds of things are happening when you're reading that story 1,000 times to that child. So when that happens and you're like, I can't read this again, just think about that you're strengthening those neural connections. So yeah. So just a quick slide of how you can be supportive of healthy brain development. This is by far no means an extensive list, an exhaustive list. These are just a couple of things that can be very beneficial as you are working with young children and families, right? So if you're not working directly with young children, you can support families in helping them learn more about brain development and what constitutes or what impacts healthy brain development. So we have a couple of minutes here before we finish. Let me pause one more time to see if you have any thoughts or questions before we do our last little activity of the evening.
Just like all this things reminds me the core values that we are learning from the NACI.
Yeah, from NACI, yeah.
And if some of them talk about respecting the kids and all of this, just like what it reminds me, like respect them, like taking care of them. Yeah.
Yeah, that's a great connection, Adriana, to make. And that's a perfect segue into our last slide here. So we're talking about the core values that we want to share as early childhood educators when we're working with children and families. So yeah, I gave you a lot of information tonight, a ton of information, a lot to process. So, but in this moment, as you're kind of fresh with all of this new, maybe not new, but all of this information kind of floating around, how does this information on neurons and brain architecture modify or strengthen your thinking about children's cognitive, physical, and social emotional development? How might this change your practice or strengthen your practice? What information might you want to share with families? So don't worry so much about the questions. Just take a moment to read them. Give me a moment here, quick moment. Sort of a little bit of like a jumping off point. Don't worry so much about the questions themselves, but I think we will have just a couple of minutes to do a couple of quick breakout rooms, just for like 4 or 5 minutes, and just take an opportunity to share with each other anything that maybe, you know, stood out for you, something that you learned, something that will maybe change your practice, or something that you'd want to share with families, something that brought anything up for you, anything like that, just any kind of response that you had to this information tonight. So I do want to make sure we get out on time. So let me just do 2 quick breakout rooms and just do about 4 or 5 minutes in each. See you back here in 4 minutes. Okay, 4 minutes. I just want to show you our weekly readings and assignments for this upcoming week, just so you can, I'll send this out tomorrow, but just so you have an understanding of what we're going to be doing. So as I was sharing with you, we're going to do some modules, and they're very easy to follow, to understand. You're just going to, you know, click on the link and follow the directions. But just so you know, it's a little bit different than kind of a list of readings, although there are some that you can select from the Choose Your Own Adventure list. I'm not going to be asking you for any kind of proof that you completed the modules. So you are on your, I'm just trusting you that you're going to complete those, and that you will have a reflection to follow up with that as well. I also just want to point out here that this personal philosophy of see, it's end of the night, right? Personal philosophy of education is going to be, as I mentioned in the first part of our PLC earlier, Sunday the 18th, giving you till 10 p.m. But I hope you're not taking till 10 p.m. because you need your rest too for your brains, right? Good function of your brains. So the assignment is here. I'll also include the instructions when I send my email tomorrow. But just wanted to point out that's what we are doing. Any quick questions about this? And I will stay on. I'll always stay on for another, couple of minutes after we're done. So if you have any questions or want to follow up with anything, I'm available. Okay. Well, thank you so much for staying a couple of minutes late. I try not to do that, but I appreciate you staying on, being present,